The cliff wore its silence like a veil, the wind its only voice. Long grass bent low near its edge, as if paying quiet respect to the bones of secrets buried deep below. At the rim, a single red ribbon fluttered, caught on a thorn bush, its end torn and frayed like the memory of a scream. The kind of scream the earth swallows, but the sky remembers. She had once loved this view. When she was small, her father would bring her here with a hand-rolled map and a tin of black coffee. He'd point to the horizon and speak of land like it was a hymn. Back then, her name still held warmth in town. Back then, she believed silence meant peace. Now, her body hung limp in the grasp of two lawmen, her boots dragging dusty trails behind her. Her cheeks were cut, not from struggle, but from the scrub of dry thorns they'd made her crawl through the night before. The buttons on her dress had come loose. Her mouth was dry and lined with dust, but she would not speak. Not to them. Not for him. The sheriff waited by the edge, boots polished, gloves clean. He stood with the arrogance of a man who'd never heard no without echoing rage. His badge caught the morning sun like a knife's glint, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. He had once courted her, if you could call it that. Polite words wrapped in barbed expectation. Every Sunday, he'd ride to her land, her father long buried by then, bringing sweet cakes or fine cloth, speaking of safety, of union, of power. Not once did he ask what she wanted. Not once did he see her as more than possession. She had refused him only once. But once, for men like him, was rebellion. They said she'd stolen from the town, milk bread, a length of rope. Petty things she hadn't touched. No trial was held. Just a whisper passed through saloons and porches that she'd wronged the law and must be taught. She did not cry as they brought her to the edge. Not when the first boot kicked her knee to the dirt. Not when the lawman spat beside her head. She looked to the sky instead, wondering if her father could see her, and if so, what words he would send with the wind. She falls, the sheriff said with indifference, or she belongs to me. Her choice. Her silence was answer enough. The world tipped. Her body followed. But fate, or perhaps something older, caught her. A gnarled tree root twisted out from the cliff face like a hand reaching from the grave. Her dress snagged, then tore, catching again. Her fall broke not with a thud, but a slide, her skin scorched against stone, her shoulder slamming into a jut of rock before she tumbled down into the scrub below. She did not die. She lay crumpled in a ravine's shadow, somewhere between bone-breaking pain and a dreamlike stillness. The canyon around her stretched wide and mute, its red walls whispering heat. Her breath came shallow. Her wrist bent wrongly. Her lips split. Above her, a hawk circled, curious, not cruel. Night came and brought cold teeth with it. She clawed weakly toward a bush, trying to curl beneath its brittle branches. Coyotes watched from the ridge, their yellow eyes flickering. She had no name here. No witness. The sheriff would sleep warm tonight. Justice would not ride for her. But something did. The sound came first, the low snort of a horse, cautious and curious. Then the shift of boots in gravel. A silhouette emerged, tall, quiet, leaning slightly as if he still carried weight from long ago. He found her before sunrise. Not because he was searching for anyone, but because he knew these lands better than most. The rancher was not a man of many words. Folks in town called him the ghost of Hollowbend. He seldom spoke, never laughed, and kept to the farthest end of the valley with only a mare and a tired dog for company. When he saw her, he didn't ask questions. He didn't reach quickly or speak loudly. He just knelt beside her, removed his hat and looked, really looked, at the wreck of a girl before him. Her eyes, swollen and red, met his. Something passed between them, not understanding, not pity, but something gentler, like recognition. He gathered her carefully, his arms strong but trembling. Her weight against him was nothing. He'd carried grief heavier than this. He placed her on his horse and walked beside her all the way home, whispering something low under his breath every few minutes. Not prayers. Not curses. just the sound of a man keeping her tethered to the world. By the time he laid her down in the corner of his cabin, the fire had begun to warm the floorboards. He covered her with wool, brought water in a tin cup, and left her be. No names exchanged. No promises made. But she didn't dream of cliffs that night. She dreamed of the scent of wood smoke, of calloused hands that moved gently, of the faint sound of wind through pines, not screams. When morning broke, the red ribbon still clung to the thorn bush above the canyon. But down in the valley, a girl no longer wished for death. And a man who thought he'd buried his heart in winter snow felt the faintest ache of spring. There, in the hush of that fragile dawn, a story began. It wasn't the kind of story the town would write in ledgers or whisper over poker tables. But it was the kind that mattered, made not of fire or fury, but of something far more dangerous: hope. The cabin was quiet, built of cedar and silence. Light pooled through the single window in long golden strokes, laying itself gently across the wooden floor like a prayer. Somewhere outside, a mare huffed against her bridle, and a chicken scratched in the dust near the porch, but within, time moved slowly. Like healing. She didn't wake with fear. Not this time. Instead, her first breath tasted of warm air and cedar smoke. Her eyes opened to the ceiling's exposed beams, and a knitted quilt weighed across her chest, rough but lovingly mended. She tried to sit, but a sharp pulse in her side stopped her. Then she saw him, sitting by the hearth, mending something in his lap with thick, sure fingers. He looked up. His face was all dusk and distance, the kind of face shaped more by silence than by speech. A wide jaw dusted with unshaved scruff. Eyes like soft riverstone, pale but not cold. Not once did he flinch at her staring. He merely nodded once, as if they'd already met 100 times in another life. He didn't speak, not that day. He moved around her with the quiet skill of someone who knew how to avoid startling wounded animals. Each morning, he left food on a tray, boiled oats, stewed apples, sometimes a fresh egg. Each evening, he poured warm water into a bowl, set out clean cloth, and left her be. No questions. No pity. She found herself watching him more than she meant to. The way he walked, slow but certain. The way he touched the mare's flank before feeding her, murmuring something only the animal could understand. He seemed stitched from the very land around him, not added to it like so many other men, but grown from it. Her wounds slowly closed, though her ankle still bore a purplish bruise like a cloud caught beneath her skin. He had braced it with a cut strip of old saddle leather and wrapped it tight in linen. His hands had trembled slightly when he touched her, not from fear, but from restraint, as though holding her too firmly might break something far more delicate than bones. One afternoon, she found the strength to rise and hobble to the door. The sun met her face with warmth she had not known since before the cliff. The land stretched wide and gentle, no town in sight, no voices to shrink from, only wind and wheat and the soft hum of insects. The dog, an old mutt with one ear torn and a limp in his gait, rose and followed her like a shadow. She sat on the porch and let the sun bake the memory of bruises from her skin. He returned from the field with hay in his arms and paused when he saw her. There was no surprise in his face, only a slow, deep acknowledgement. As if he'd known she would come to the sun when she was ready. As if healing had its own tide, and he had learned long ago not to rush the current. That evening, she broke the silence. Her voice was soft, hoarse from disuse, but steady. "You never asked me my name." He didn't look up from the pot he stirred, only replied after a moment, "Didn't think you were ready to give it." The words settled between them like something sacred. She gave it then, just her first name, no past attached. He offered his. Elias. A name that felt like weathered wood, strong and simple. Over time, more words came. Not many, but enough. He told her about the ranch. Not inherited, but built with calloused hands and 10 winters of labor. About his wife, who had passed from fever 5 years back. About the child they had buried beneath a cedar tree up the hill, wrapped in a quilt much like the one that now warmed her each night. He didn't speak with drama. Just the facts, softened by time. She listened, and in her listening, something changed in her, not in great strides but in slow bends. Like a tree learning to grow around a fence post. She began helping where she could. Sweeping the porch, feeding the dog, peeling potatoes with clumsy fingers. He never directed her, never asked. But he left a space open beside him in every task, and she filled it. One morning, she found a bundle of fabric beside her tray, an old dress of his late wife's, altered with care. The sleeves taken in. The hem raised. She held it in her hands for a long time before changing into it. It fit, not perfectly but kindly. That evening, she saddled his mare. Her ankle still ached, but she managed. Elias watched from the porch, silent, then walked down to join her. He adjusted the cinch without a word. They rode in silence, side by side across the golden field, their shadows long and narrow behind them. No destination. Just motion. When they returned, she turned to him before dismounting. "Why did you help me?" she asked, eyes searching his face. He held her gaze for a long moment, then answered, "You looked like someone who needed silence more than saving." Her breath caught, not from pain, but from recognition. She had lived her whole life surrounded by voices that wanted to shape her, possess her, bend her into usefulness. But this man had offered her the rarest thing, space. A place to be broken without shame. To be seen without fear. That night, she dreamed not of cliffs or falling, but of a wide table where bread was broken, where laughter was soft and tired, and where no one waited for her to explain her worth. The next morning, she stood by the hearth before he woke. She placed the ribbon, that same one torn on the cliff's edge, on the windowsill, its ends tied together now. A small offering. A silent thank you. When he saw it, he touched it gently, then nodded to her once across the room. And though no promises were spoken, they both knew. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Not as strangers or saviors, but as two people who had survived, not through rage or revenge, but by choosing gentleness in a world that had forgotten it. And somewhere out there, the town stirred, the sheriff's eyes narrowed, and the wind began to carry whispers down from the canyon again. But in that quiet cabin, for the first time in a long while, she felt something dangerous blooming in her chest. A beginning. It began with a glance at the wrong stall in town. She had gone with Elias that day, riding quietly beside him as the sun pressed hot into their backs. He had needed seed and salt, and she had needed to remember how to walk among people again. The town had not changed. The same cracked sign above the general store. The same man whittling on the porch who never looked up. But something had shifted in her. She no longer walked with her shoulders folded in like wings hiding from weather. She stood taller now, though her eyes stayed wary. Elias didn't leave her side. He didn't hover, didn't crowd her. Just kept close, his presence quiet and steady. Like a rock wall against sudden wind. They were almost finished, basket half full, when a voice rang out sharp and oily from behind the stall selling cured meat. "I'll be damned. Thought you were buzzard food by now." The words sliced through her, clean and cruel. She turned slowly. A boy stood there, not a man, not yet, though his eyes pretended otherwise. The son of a rancher who drank too much and gambled worse. She remembered him. He'd been there that day on the cliff. Had laughed when her knees hit dirt. Now he smirked like he'd seen a ghost with skin. Elias stepped forward, not with fists but with stillness. His hand didn't reach for a weapon. He only looked at the boy, and whatever he saw was enough to quiet him. The smirk faltered. A moment later, the boy turned away, muttering. But the damage had been done. That night, the wind blew hard through the valley, knocking over an empty bucket and rattling the stable door. She couldn't sleep. Her mind traced the sound of that voice over and over, like a splinter she couldn't pull out. "They know," she whispered to Elias as they sat by the dying fire. "They know I lived." He looked up from the bit of leather he'd been oiling. His expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes dimmed slightly. Not fear, only recognition. He had always known the world would come knocking again. "They'll come," she said. "They might," he replied. She stared at the flame, then said what she'd been holding in her ribs since that first night in his cabin. "I don't want to run any more." He nodded. "Then we won't." The next morning brought hoofbeat. Not hurried, but heavy. 3 riders. She knew the shapes before they even passed the gate. One wore the badge. The sheriff hadn't aged in the way men ought to. His face was tighter, his eyes more polished, as though cleaned daily with whiskey and hatred. He dismounted with flair, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "Well, well," he drawled, "like finding a coin you thought you lost." She stood behind Elias, but she didn't hide. "I was told you died," he said, letting the words stretch like taffy. "No," she answered. "You were told I fell." His lip twitched. "And yet here you are, living unlawfully on land that should be reclaimed. You disappeared. Law says abandoned land reverts to town ownership." "This land isn't town land," Elias said, his voice low. "It's mine. And she's here by invitation." The sheriff turned to Elias slowly. His smile stayed, but his eyes sharpened. "She's got charges against her. Theft. Avoiding custody. And if memory serves, she promised herself to me." "I never did," she said, stepping forward now. "You lied. You threatened. You refused protection," he said smoothly. "Call it what you like. It's binding all the same." Elias moved then, not suddenly, but decisively. He stepped between them. "You'll leave now." The silence that followed felt like winter pressing into autumn. The sheriff held his ground for a moment, then clicked his tongue and turned away. "Be careful who you shelter," he called over his shoulder. "The law don't always knock first." After they rode off, she stood staring at the horizon, her heart pacing inside her chest. "I should have died," she murmured. Elias didn't answer. He just walked back to the barn. That night, she stood at the table, sorting through a box of old papers she hadn't touched in years. Letters from her father. One sealed envelope. A deed with his signature at the bottom. Legal. Binding. Proof. She hadn't been ready before. But she was now. "They took everything from him," she whispered, voice trembling. "Then tried to take me. But I have his words. I have the paper." Elias sat beside her, turning the sealed envelope over in his hands. "This is yours," he said. "Your name, your story." "I want to fight," she said. He didn't smile. Didn't nod. But he laid his hand gently over hers and said, "Then I'll stand with you." The next day they rode together. Not toward escape, but toward truth. The land stretched before them, wild and endless, as the town's outline sharpened in the distance. Her hands trembled against the reins, but she held steady. As they passed the ravine where the cliff rose sharp in the morning light, she looked to the thorn bush still clinging to the edge. The place where the ribbon had torn. The place where she should have died. But instead, she reached into her saddlebag and took out something wrapped in cloth. The wooden horse Elias had carved for her, long ago, when neither had known what would come next. She placed it at the cliff's edge, anchoring it in the stone. Not a memorial. A marker. A beginning carved from the place they tried to make her end. They rode on, and with each hoofbeat she shed another fear. By the time they reached the town, she no longer carried silence. She carried truth. And truth, when held gently, becomes the sharpest thing of all. The town didn't welcome her. Not openly. Not with flowers or kind eyes or warm hands. But neither did it chase her off. It watched, tight-lipped and slow-blinking, like a dog that's been kicked too many times to bark. She rode beside Elias, her back straight, the deed tucked into the fold of her satchel like a quiet thunderclap. No one tried to stop her, not yet. But eyes followed her down the dusty street, some startled, some unreadable, others burning with a recognition they did not want to feel. The sheriff was nowhere in sight, but his presence stretched like an oil slick through every doorway. It clung to porch rails and bar stools, lived in the too long glances of the townsfolk. No lawman had ever been challenged here, not in this way. And certainly not by a girl who'd been left for dead. At the general store, Elias dismounted first, tying his reins to the post with steady hands. She followed, boots meeting the ground with more certainty than her heart. Still, she walked forward. Because some things, dignity, memory, fire, only live when carried through fear. Inside, the clerk looked up, startled, and nearly dropped the jar he was arranging. Need a copy made, Elias said simply. Official seal. Public record. The clerk blinked, glanced between them, then toward the window as if to see whether the sun was still in the sky. She unrolled the deed. Laid it flat. Her father's name, written in ink that had faded but not vanished. A seal still legible. Witness. Dated. Where'd you get this? The clerk asked, his voice dry. It was left for me, she answered. It was always mine. The man didn't argue. Didn't want to. He took it, his fingers trembling slightly as he slid it into a leather folio and walked it toward the back room. Minutes later, the heavy press was heard. The kind used for town archives, for birth records and land claims. She exhaled only when he handed it back. 2 copies now. One for her. One for the record. As they stepped outside, Elias touched her arm lightly. A gesture without words. Not comfort, recognition. But the quiet wouldn't last. By dusk, the news had spread like wildfire under a dry sky. She was back. She had proof. She had not only lived, she had returned with power. The sheriff came at nightfall. Not in a rage, but with a smirk. That was worse. Rage could be fought. A smirk meant he thought he'd already won. He arrived at Elias's ranch, bringing 3 men, each one dressed in a false kind of order. Pressed shirts, clean boots, but eyes full of dirt. You've gone and made yourself quite the story, haven't you? The sheriff said, dismounting with all the calm of a man walking into a room he owned. I didn't write it, she replied, standing on the porch. You did. I just found the ending. He chuckled, slow and syrupy. That paper don't change what folks remember. What they believe. You were gone. Gone means forgotten. No, Elias said from behind her. Gone means surviving. The sheriff's eyes shifted to Elias, measuring. Then he moved closer, up the steps without invitation. The ranch dog growled low, but didn't move. You think that document makes her safe? He said, voice cooling. It makes her a problem. That land was claimed. You left it unattended. The town began proceedings. You don't get to vanish and come back righteous. You don't get to push a woman off a cliff and call it paperwork, Elias answered. The silence afterward was thick, unbreathing. The sheriff's jaw clenched once. Watch your tongue. No, Elias said softly. You watch what you've become. The sheriff's hand hovered over his hip, not quite at his gun, but close enough to speak volumes. The moment stretched. Dust rose in a spiral between them. Then the dog barked, just once, sharp and high. And that was enough. The sheriff stepped back. Tomorrow morning, he said. The judge arrives for spring circuit. We'll see what he says about your little story. I hope you've got more than a memory to lean on. Then he turned, mounted, and vanished into the night with his shadows in tow. She sat on the porch after they left, staring into the dark that smelled like horses and rain. They'll try to twist it, she said. They'll say I faked the papers, that I broke laws, that I'm damaged. They'll say whatever helps them sleep, Elias answered. She looked over at him. What if the judge listens? Then we speak the truth, he said. And if he doesn't, we speak it louder. The moon rose slowly. Coyotes howled once. The house held its breath. She went inside and pulled the old box from beneath Elias's bed. The one filled with her father's letters, folded in threes and stained with years. She selected one, unopened, and read it by the fire. It was written just before he died, the words cramped with urgency but still elegant. My girl, if you're reading this, you've come through something. Maybe loss. Maybe war. Maybe both. Asterisk asterisk. I've built a life on this land, but the land means nothing without someone to carry it forward. You have always had the strength. It's in your bones, not your voice. In your silence, not your rage. Asterisk asterisk. If they come for you, let them come. But never, never forget, your story is not theirs to finish. Asterisk asterisk. With love, always. Father asterisk asterisk. The fire cracked. Outside, a soft rain began to fall. Elias entered quietly. He saw the letter, didn't ask what it said. But she told him anyway. And when she finished, he reached across the table and laid his hand gently over hers. I'll be with you, he said. Whatever they say tomorrow. However loud it gets. She met his eyes and nodded. And though fear still pressed against the edges of her breath, it no longer owned her. Because now she had a name, a voice, a truth that did not need permission. Tomorrow would bring the court, the whispers, the weight of men trying to keep their lies afloat. But she would walk into that room not as a victim, not as a ghost, not as the girl who fell. She would walk in as the woman who rose. And the sheriff, for all his titles and shine, would have to face the one thing he had never learned to fight. A woman who had survived him. And remembered. The courthouse sat on the edge of town like a faded truth no one wanted to speak aloud. Its whitewashed boards peeled with sun and time, and its door creaked with the weight of years. Inside, it smelled of ink and dust and decisions made by men who rarely questioned themselves. By mid-morning, the benches were full. Word had spread like it always did in towns where justice arrived in a wagon and stayed only for the afternoon. She stood at the front, straight-backed in a dress Elias had helped mend the night before. Her hair was braided and tied low, practical and quiet. She held no lawyer's briefcase, no stack of papers, just the deed and her father's letter folded tightly in her palm. Elias stood behind her, a step back but present, his silence louder than the gossip that swirled in low murmurs around them. The sheriff leaned on the rail, smug as ever, arms folded like he was waiting to be amused. He wore his badge with a shine polished just for the occasion. Behind him sat two of his men and the merchant's son who'd seen her in town weeks ago, all with eyes that flickered when met with hers. The judge entered, an older man with a slow walk and a wide belt, spectacles perched low. His face was unreadable, lined by a lifetime of men lying beneath oath. He sat, looked once at her, then at the sheriff, then down at the open book in front of him. This matter, he began, concerns land, alleged misconduct, and questions of identity. You, young woman, claim to be the rightful heir of the Sutton homestead. I do, she said. Her voice didn't waver. Your name. She gave it, full and clear. The name her father gave her, the name the sheriff had tried to bury under stone and silence. And your proof. She stepped forward, placed the deed on the table with both hands. Then, without hesitation, she laid the letter beside it. The judge read in silence. The room held stillness like breath held too long. Then he looked up. This appears valid, he said. Seal matches county records. Date checked. Signature as well. Before anyone could speak, the sheriff cleared his throat. With respect, he said, voice oily, we all know papers can be forged. A document don't prove where she's been these past months. She vanished. That land was considered abandoned. She forfeited her claim when she ran. I didn't run, she said, turning to face him fully now. I was pushed. Gasps rippled, but she didn't look away from him. You dragged me from my home. You told the town I was a thief. And then, when I said no to you, you had your men take me to the canyon. You said I could marry you or vanish. I chose neither. I lived. The sheriff let out a cold chuckle. And who's to say that ain't just a tale spun to get sympathy? I am, came Elias's voice, steady from the back of the room. I found her at the bottom of the canyon, near broken. I carried her home, nursed her back to life. And who are you? The judge asked. Elias Ward. I own the ranch south of the creek. I got nothing to gain from lying. But I watched this woman fight to walk again. I saw the bruises, the wounds, the fear. Fear ain't proof, the sheriff snapped. No, Elias said. But scars are. Without a word, she rolled up her sleeve, revealing the long, twisted mark down her arm. She turned slightly, lifting the hem of her dress just enough to show the jagged line along her thigh. You did this, she said. You tried to erase me. The room was silent now. Till even the merchant's son stared at the floor. The judge leaned back, long fingers steepled under his chin. This is a heavy accusation, he said finally. But the law cares for evidence. For truth. He turned to the sheriff. You deny these charges? Absolutely, the sheriff said, face red. It's a story. She's manipulating a good man's death for land. The judge nodded once. Then allow me to show you what else was found. He reached beneath the table, pulled out another envelope, aged sealed. This letter, he said, was submitted by Miss Sutton last night. It contains a statement written by her father, months before his passing. In it, he explains his fears. He names the sheriff, describes the threat, the pressure, the attempts to seize his land. This is not a new tale. It's one we failed to listen to in time. The sheriff stepped back. His mouth opened, then shut. The circuit will investigate further, the judge continued. But as of now, this court restores full ownership of the Sutton land to its rightful heir, and places Sheriff Alcott under immediate suspension pending further inquiry. The words didn't roar. They dropped like hammers. The room broke into murmurs. The sheriff cursed under his breath, then shoved past the benches, knocking the merchant's son sideways. No one followed him. She stood still as stone. It wasn't victory she felt. Not pride. Just release. Like someone had lifted a weight she didn't know she'd learned to carry. Outside, the wind picked up. Elias touched her shoulder lightly. You did it. No, she said, turning to him. We did. He smiled, and in that smile, there was something warm and weathered and wonderfully unfinished. They didn't linger in town. There was nothing left to prove. Back at the ranch, the sun was falling in amber streaks across the hills. The dog barked once at the gate, then returned to sleep. She walked the edge of her land, barefoot, feeling the dirt she now owned not just by blood, but by will. She stopped near the old tree, the one Elias had once leaned against while whittling. She sat beneath it, pulled the letter from her father once more, and read it aloud, voice soft but sure. Elias joined her after a while. Sat beside her without needing words. Together, they watched the light change. Later, as the stars began to appear like old friends returning home, she leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, It's strange. What is? How something meant to end me became the thing that saved me. He wrapped an arm around her and said, Some stories only grow after the fall. She nodded, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt whole. Not because the world had changed, but because she had. And somewhere, beyond the ridge, the wind carried no lies. Only truth. Only the quiet sound of two hearts, healing.